in the Philippines is actually emphasized, no, with regards to to its chairmanship, or the chairmanship of the Philippines, no, in ASEAN in 2017, okay, is the drive to make sure, or trying to make sure, okay, that a framework for the code of conduct should at least be finished by this year. In other words, not the code of conduct itself, but a framework, right? That's probably doable. But this goes back to the point that Siseng was actually saying, that, you know, again, you're talking about the possibility of something that might have to be less than, no, what is ideal, okay? But at least something to start on, I guess, no? But this illustrates to us how important ASEAN has been to that, to the development of multilateralism, and the benefits that multilateralism has actually provided, no, to East Asia. And in this context, no, it's the continuity of the strengthening of that drive towards multilateralism. I will talk about, to a certain extent, rethinking, no, the position of ASEAN in this, but I think the emphasis here would be in the idea, in terms of the idea of, you know, strengthening multilateralism, no, hence the emphasis on continuity. Just to point out, no, or to illustrate, no, what needs to be done, especially when we talk about economic relations and why continuity becomes important, right? Is of course the continued drive towards economic integration, no, that will allow ASEAN to become an even more important economic player, no, in the region. But more importantly than that, no, is of course the second bullet point, okay? The notion of the need to actually reduce further, even further, or actually reduce at a faster rate, if you will, no, development gaps within ASEAN. Okay, I think to a certain extent, no, the threats or the vulnerabilities of the ASEAN-driven, no, multilateralism, in what Busan refers to as the trend towards, no, balancing, for instance, no, is found in the weakness, or at least the gaps, no, that exist, no, in economic development. So, which means that you're talking about some ASEAN states becoming vulnerable to, say, great power pressure. You know? If ASEAN were much more unified, no, and much more concerned about, no, growing the economies of each other, then this kind of vulnerabilities won't be able to play on the vulnerabilities of ASEAN itself, okay? And therefore, no, the need to strengthen intra-ASEAN economic engagement. And so in this context, you know, it's really looking at what is in the ASEAN economic community blueprint, no, and how to move those things forward, right? This is not to say that we need to institutionalize very quickly and very intensively. You know, there is an advantage to actually being more informal in the way that we do things. But at the same time, you know, we have to take seriously the idea that the conditions faced by ASEAN right now might require it to have a more serious thought, or to give a more serious thought, no, to the importance of some degree of institutionalization as far as cooperation is actually concerned. Okay, this slide indicates to us, no, how much ASEAN has actually contributed, and I think this proves, or at least illustrates to us, no, how important it is for ASEAN to actually strengthen intra-ASEAN cooperation. The ASEAN 5, the most developed members of ASEAN, only contributes, no, a little less than 5%, no, of the world's GDP. Okay, that's not a lot if you actually think in terms of what ASEAN has actually achieved. Okay, the second slide here illustrates to us, no, the share in the growth of the growth in the share of ASEAN's share of the global GDP. In 1980, it was 2.82%. Okay, now, admittedly, you're talking about the original 5 there, okay? By 2020, no, it's 3.6%. That's not a lot of progress, no, in terms of how much ASEAN. And we keep on talking about the idea that ASEAN actually has a large population. I think we just talked about being third in the world, if that's not the case. So which means that more has to be done, no, as far as inter-ASEAN cooperation in economic terms, no, is concerned, if we are to actually increase ASEAN's clout, no, economically. And I think a major part of this, no, is the idea of continuity in terms of strengthening multilateralism. If I go by this second pie, for instance, no, it's quite interesting because if you look at the percentages there, the East Asian component, no, could grow up to as much as 32 to 33%, no, of global GDP, and yet only 3 to 4% of that is actually being contributed by ASEAN. That's not a lot. We need to do more, no, as far as cooperation is concerned. Okay, but the other point, no, and I mentioned this earlier on, no, is the increasing impact of China on the region, and that includes, no, the vulnerabilities that are actually created, no, by great power dynamics, no, the competition between China and the United States on the unity of ASEAN itself, no, and if we actually need to push, if we need to actually push multilateralism, no, then strategies have to be put forward or put together, no, in order to actually deal with this intensifying rivalry. The rivalry is actually quite interesting, you know, because if I mentioned earlier on the share, no, 30 to 30, as much as 40% of the global productivity is actually going to be produced by East Asia. No, this graph actually shows that, no, just the contribution of China and India, no, is a very significant part of that. If we include the United States there, no, then we can see, or at least begin to infer, no, just how important, no, the great power dynamics are to the continued effectivity of ASEAN, no, in the next 50 years. No. Again, just to emphasize this, no, a 1% slowdown in China, no, would actually have this effect, no, on the ASEAN countries. No, everybody's economy would actually suffer, no, some decrease, no, and only a few would actually be minimally affected by this. No, this brings me now, no, to my second C. My second C is consolidation. No, and this goes back to the point that was actually made by Siseng earlier on. Maybe ASEAN is taking on too big a role, no, too large a responsibility. No. Those who watch Spider-Man, no, are familiar with the point about with great power comes great responsibility. No, we don't do it the other way around. In other words, we don't take on great responsibility if you're not a great power. No, and I think that's the point. No, with ASEAN, no, there has to be some sort of shall we say moderation, no, as far as what it is that we need to do. Okay, ASEAN centrality, okay, is coming up, no, against the issues of great power dynamics, right? I think we need to redefine ASEAN centrality, not in terms of the centrality of ASEAN to the entire Asia Pacific, but the centrality of ASEAN to the ASEAN states themselves. No? In other words, the concerns of the ASEAN states, no, must be something that ASEAN, no, must actually deal with. Okay, so this means consolidating, no, reducing what it is that needs to that are actually important, no, to ASEAN. And then finally, no, my third C and my last slide. No, my third C is people-centeredness. No, that is to say, we're not. See, if you're looking at where we're headed, no, I think one of the points that have been given little emphasis, no, in the past few years, no, is of course the socio-cultural community. The idea of trying to deepen, no, the meaning and importance of ASEAN, no, not only across ASEAN official elites, no, but also deeper, no, into across ASEAN peoples, right? I think this would help, no, in the strengthening of ASEAN itself, no, and the importance, no, of ASEAN, not or of ASEAN centrality, not to East Asia, but to ASEAN itself, not the ASEAN states themselves. So those are my three C's, and basically those are the points that I'd like to make. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Herman. That's kind of very, very interesting that everybody is playing on the three C's. And again, as we can, you can show out to your confidence that the chairmanship of the Philippines will bring the brighter for ASEAN community. Then we shall move to our forerunner, I would say, our forerunner who have been working on this ASEAN diplomatic talk and diplomatic community over 40 years, I think. May I, please give a round of applause to welcome Tan Sri Dato Seri Muhammad Jawa Hassan to give his thought for the future of ASEAN, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Kun Akrapong. I'll return to the C's later.
later.
But first, my grateful thanks to my friend Kun Prapat, to the Center for ASEAN Studies of Thammasat for inviting me to be with all my friends here. I think this morning we listened to a very powerful, inspiring speech by Kun Surin. And I think he set the tone, even though he was looking back, I think also for the future. Because I'm not so able, I would like to look at some things that are more concrete. Things that we can touch and feel to some extent, and things that we are capable of doing. At my age, Kun Prapat, it's difficult to think 50 years. At my age, maybe 10 if I am lucky. So I'll confine myself to more or less that frame, not for any particular thing, but because we have an ASEAN Vision 2025. We also have the blueprints for the three communities, and they go up to 2025. So that is, about 8-9 years. So I think we can, to me, we already have what we want to do for the next 8-9 years. Of course, there will be adjustments here and there, but this is more or less what ASEAN has set itself to do. So I will come to more what I think, and there are many things we can focus upon. My colleagues this morning, this afternoon, fleshed out, highlighted a few things. I would also like to highlight 3 things. Here, I would like, but before I do that, I would like to underline what I think is a very important fact when we talk about ASEAN. Very often, when we talk about ASEAN, we are actually talking about the individual member states of ASEAN doing things on their own, but contributing to the collective well-being of ASEAN. So I will be often talking about Southeast Asia, the countries of Southeast Asia. And when they act as ASEAN, when they are organized as ASEAN, acting as ASEAN, for ASEAN, that is ASEAN. Otherwise, most of the time, if I may say so, many of the countries, or I would say all the countries in ASEAN, are actually pushing themselves. And in pushing themselves, they are creating ASEAN. So I think we have to, there's some distinction there to me, at least as I can see it. And within this, whether it is ASEAN we are talking about, or Southeast Asia, sometimes organized as ASEAN, often not organized as ASEAN, but organized as individual countries. The most important thing, including within ASEAN, is national effort. If we want ASEAN to do well, we have all of us to do a lot more within our own borders. If we do a lot more within our own borders, we will also be contributing to the well-being of ASEAN. One of the reasons why I say this is because ASEAN is not as integrated, not as much a single entity as the European Union. In the European Union, you can talk about Europe. But in ASEAN, at least at this juncture, and I believe in the next 50 years, it will be more an ASEAN in a more diluted sense and very much driven by the individual countries, but united by some shared values, common visions, etc. And this is where I hope we remain this way, mostly this way, rather than become so integrated that we become a big problem to ourselves, as Europe is discovering now. So, I would say over the last 50 years, for instance, in 1957, 50 years ago, this was a region of poverty, a region of conflict, and it was a region dominated by external powers. Today, Southeast Asia, I say Southeast Asia, is a region of growing prosperity, a region of peace, and freedom from foreign occupation. Then we had much despair 50 years ago. Today, I think we have a lot of hope. We are all thinking about the next 50 years, for instance. So, now, those who are, full brimming with ASEAN fervor will say ASEAN was responsible for where we have come in the last 50 years. I think, yes, ASEAN has contributed significantly, but the primary driver, propellant, was the individual nation states. And because individual nation states, we have moved at different speeds. Sometimes because we had a rather unfortunate past, and that has kept us behind, but at other times because some of us really did better than others. So moving forward, I think in order to move ASEAN forward, we have to move our individual selves forward. In moving our individual selves forward, we will be moving ASEAN forward. Because, as I said, ASEAN is not as integrated as, say, incidentally, there's only one entity that is integrated as EU, and that is EU. Nowhere else in the world does anyone even try. Or when they try, they can't. And this is where sometimes we make a mistake. We were pushed in 1957 to become like EU. Everything, oh, you must be like EU, you must be integrated. If you are not, you are bad, no good, you are nothing compared to EU. That is a false driver. We must find our own level of integration and our own level of particularity, which is suited to our own ecosystem. Not follow blindly, no, I wouldn't say blindly, we all said, in fact, we don't want to follow EU model, but at the back of our minds, it's always more, more, more. And if we don't, it's bad. I think in the economic dimension, there should be more coordination as well as integration, because that's the way to survive. But in the political sense, social sense, etc., we should not only, to a large extent, not to the entire extent, but to a large extent, not only remain ourselves, different selves, but value it. Value it, accept some of the bad points that many of us have, and I'll come to that. This brings me to my 3 C's, and please, I booked myself on the plane too. So the first C is to champion good governance. As we move forward in the next, I believe it will remain with us for a long time, but I think we should never forget that if we want a people-centered ASEAN, we must champion good governance. And by good governance, I think we should realize it is in short supply in many countries around the world, but it is a challenge, especially in countries that have yet to establish firmly entrenched, sound institutions and practices that are critical to good governance. And these include, for me, fair and just laws, the rule of law, an independent judiciary. We can all check ourselves in our countries where we stand. Respect for human rights and fundamental liberties. Protection of the rights of minorities. A government chosen freely by the people. Administration that is transparent and accountable to the people, people-friendly. Efficient delivery of services to the people. A free and responsible press. Effective laws and regulations against corruption, and peace and security. This is what good governance is. If each of us are very good at governance, we'll produce all these deliverables. And I think here many ASEAN countries face stiff challenges. We fare particularly badly with regard to corruption. 7 out of the 10 members are consistently, ourselves, 7 of us are consistently ranked in the bottom half of the World Corruption Perception Index of Transparency International. And then half the members of ASEAN are classified the lowest. That is, classified lowest, that is not free, the category called not free, in Freedom House's Freedom in the World Index. In that Freedom in the World Index, 5 of us are classified lowest. All the ASEAN countries are grouped in the lower 2 ranks of the Press Freedom Index in 2016. All of us, no exception. So, at the same time, I must say, because this is the glass half full. To be fair, a few of the ASEAN countries are performing satisfactorily in certain areas. And Singapore, Sising is here, is doing particularly well, from my way of looking at things, in the field of good governance, where it has certain deficits. Yeah? It is doing particularly well in the field of good governance generally, where it is in the top ranks of the first world in several indices. It joins the rank of other ASEAN countries, however, with regard to political freedoms and press freedom. Now, to the credit of ASEAN, I must say what we want to do next. We recognize this. If you look at ASEAN Vision 2025, and even if you look at the previous visions and blueprints, but since we are in this session looking ahead, if you look at ASEAN Vision 2025, if you look at the blueprints in the 3 C pillars, they address, in fact, all these things. But what ASEAN can do is very little, because it is ASEAN. So, for instance, in democracy and all that, what it says is you must meet twice a year to discuss. You exchange experiences. You don't go very far because it's very difficult. So this is what it is, underlines the fact that it is all up to us, our respective countries, to do the best we can given our circumstances, given the past, which has not been very, which has been sometimes cruel to us, yeah? So I'm very well aware of that. Some of us more fortunate, so we must be aware of all these things. So I want to move on faster. So, but in the same time, I think, while we rely on individual national interests, we must, at the same time, rely more on ASEAN to push things forward. So more and more, Kun Surin, some of us have mentioned that we should not, just refrain from commenting or being interested in other people's affairs. I think we should push ahead, but sometimes push the envelopes are slightly uncomfortable, but we must. Because more and more, we are living not only in the regional space, in global space. We simply can't help but A, noticing what's happening in each other's countries, but B, what happens in one country necessarily often has an impact on the others. So I think we also have a right to comment on each other and to push as much as we can as we go. And I think in the next 50 years, perhaps, hopefully, we'll get more comfortable with comment. We have got, as Kun Surin pointed out, in the last 10, 15 years, we have got more comfortable. And in the next 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years, hopefully, we will get more comfortable. Let me come to the second C. And this, actually, my wording is different, but since I was forced by Kun Akrapong to say C, so I said contain major power rivalry, because I want to get on the plane. So I think I don't have to dwell very far. Some of us have talked on this, but I think we have not taken this seriously. Sometimes we want to avoid it, denial, because some of us are part of this major power rivalry to some extent or other. And we don't want to look at it very much, but it has grown worse. And sad to say, ASEAN has been able to do very little, both on its, what I want to say is moderate. Moderate, but I want to contain. Moderate major power rivalry. Not only ASEAN has been able to do very little, the institution it has created, ARF, ASEAN Regional Forum, whose DNA, it was, as, what's the word for it, created for that purpose. It is to address this, confidence building, preventive diplomacy, and then conflict resolution, which was called something else because they know how difficult it is. So ASEAN, ARF has become almost irrelevant to what's happening in the Asia-Pacific region, where the trend has been downwards in terms of major power rivalry. We can discuss about why and all that later, but it has gone down. And in this regard, ASEAN, yeah, it's not part of the major powers, but the ARF, the members who are involved in deteriorating relations among themselves are members of the ARF. So that's how bad we are. So I think we have to concentrate on that. And as far as ASEAN is concerned, it must focus on two things, I think. One is cohesion. I don't count that as one of the C's, but cohesion, to be together. But the other one is zone of peace, freedom, and neutrality. Sorry, some of my friends, for instance, may cringe, this Zopman, is dead, old, this, that. But actually, that is what it's all about. Neutrality in the 50s, 60s, when it was a different kind of game. Yeah, neutrality means don't get involved in major power rivalry. You become passive. But Zopman now means not you don't get involved, but you must be proactive in trying to moderate, contain major power rivalry. Because otherwise, why did you create ARF? So you see, we have a responsibility to moderate and contain. Now that doesn't mean we do the containing, moderate. We have ideas, initiatives. Say UN to do this, or so and so to do that. I know we are all small, middle, we have our limits, but ASEAN can push, but we are not. We are leaving it. So that's the second C. The final C, how many minutes I have? 2. 8 minutes. How much? 5. Oh, okay. Is to capitalize. Capitalize on one belt, one road. Now, I think that's very important. We have a moment, historical moment of opportunity for ASEAN with China's initiative for OBOR, One Belt, One Road. We should embrace it, at the same time do so very carefully so that we don't become a pawn of China. Now, in fact, what China is doing, the fundamental emphasis is on infrastructure. Whether infrastructure on land, one road, or one belt, infrastructure on sea. And where it is infrastructure on sea as well as on road, ASEAN stands to gain very, very much. And ASEAN needs, one of our greatest requirements is funding for infrastructure. Indonesia particularly reads the most, but